Well, as we continue on into Proverbs 10, we're in verse 18 today. And as I mentioned yesterday, that in these Proverbs, there's kind of a new topic that's inserted with each set of Proverbs. And verse 18 is no exception, because we moved from talking about money to talking about being an example. And now he's talking about lies or dishonesty. In other words, he says in verse 18, he who conceals his hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. In other words, he's telling us basically there are some people out there who we call them velvet claws. They come across as very loving, very charming, but underneath that facade, there is deep hatred. And if they're going to be dishonest about their true emotions, the things that are kind of come out of their mouth are also going to be filled with untruths. And one of the things he talks about is, of course, is slander. Whoever spreads slander, he says, is a fool. Now, slander is interesting because the way it's used in the Bible doesn't mean it's untrue necessarily. Now, saying something that's derogatory about somebody that's not true, that is a form of slander. But in the biblical sense, if you go around saying things that are designed to diminish other people's opinion of someone, that's also a kind of slander. And that's why when we talk about lying, you can have all kinds of lies. It was Mark Twain, he was, in his autobiography, he said he was quoting Disraeli, the English prime minister during Queen Victoria's reign. But he said, basically, there are three kinds of lies. There are lies, he said, they're damned lies, and then there's statistics. And of course, Twain was suggesting that many times statistics are used as a way to give a factual feeling for something that isn't factual whatsoever. We call it poll taking. Our political polls are filled with all sorts of statistical lies, or we can call them anomalies. But basically, you know, they're designed to give a false impression, as we've seen over the last couple of presidential elections, where the winner often had a lower poll rating than the person who lost. So, you know, you realize that a lot of these pollsters can't be trusted. But you think about it, there's like, probably about 13 different ways that we can lie. The first one is, of course, obvious direct lies. When we say something that's absolutely, obviously not true. For example, your wife may come in and say, "Where did all the cookies go?" And you said, "I didn't eat them." When in fact, you have chocolate on the edges of your mouth and crumbs on your cheek. I mean, you're just being outright dishonest. And so that's a direct lie. We understand that, where people just say something that's patently untrue. But there's also another form of lying that's not quite as obvious, and that's exaggeration. You stretch the truth. I mean, it's got a degree of truth, but it's not fully the truth. In fact, we have a half-truth that Satan told Eve. He said, if you eat the fruit that's forbidden, you won't die. And it's almost as if he was saying under his breath, you won't die at least immediately. And then he said, you'll become like God, which was somewhat true. They became like God in one regard. They suddenly had the knowledge of both good and evil, which is something they didn't possess prior to that. So it was really a distortion of what was actually the fact. It had some fact in it, and exaggerations like that. They have a degree of fact, but they basically inflate it so that we say the fish I caught was this big. Well, we're talking about between our thumbs, and we're giving the impression it's between our little fingers, when in fact the fish was really just kind of a little tiny fish. Well, and then there's a thing called minimization, where you say, well, it's not really that big a thing. It's not really that serious. You know, it's like you come up to your parents and say, I got in an accident. And they say, what happened? Oh, it's nothing. It's not really that bad. And then you say, well, where's your car? Well, it was totaled. So the point is that you're trying to downplay the importance of what you did. And we'll say sometimes when we make a mistake, well, it was just a small mistake. I remember my dear mother, when her mental acuity was really beginning to deteriorate much faster than we realized, and she ended up sending tens of thousands of dollars to an anonymous person that we don't know of in Costa Rica, who claimed to be a CIA agent. Well, he was not only a bold-faced liar, but when I confronted her on that fact, she kept on saying, well, it wasn't that big a deal. It was just a little mistake. And I said, Mom, $71,000 is not a little mistake. So anyway, that's where you learn it's easy come and easy go. But, that's what she was doing. She was minimizing the significance of what she had done. And then there's the problem of lying by omission. And this is really what you find oftentimes in contracts. At least it was up until more recently. But today they can't just leave something out that's critical. What they do is they put it in such small print that you can't read it. But, it's just simply by telling somebody you weren't where you were. And it's, or you weren't doing what you were doing. You just leave out the facts. Where have you been? Oh, I've just been driving around. But you don't tell them where you've been driving. So you leave out some of the information because you might feel that it'll reflect negatively upon you. Or then there's misleading or deceptive truths where what you're saying is technically true, but you're not wanting them to find out. Basically, you're saying, well, where have you been today? I've been in my office all day long. When in fact, you left the office at 2:00 and you have been doing something else that you don't want them to know that you're doing. So it's kind of that deceptiveness, or people basically calling in sick when they're not sick. They just don't want to come to work. In fact, it's interesting. I even heard some pastor recommending that people would do something like that. I thought, that doesn't make much sense to me. But anyway, and then there's what we call them white lies, which basically we say polite things because we don't want to harm somebody's or hurt somebody's feeling. When somebody's saying, well, you caught me off guard. I'm not cleaned up and ready and look good. And you go, you look great. Well, you may not really believe they look great. It'd be more honest to say, well, that's okay. I still like you. Instead of telling them that they don't look bad when they actually look bad. And then we use pretense or bluffing where we pretend to have a stronger position and knowledge that we actually are. Well, I could go on and on with this, but you understand what I'm talking about. Just to read just some of the ideas that we've come up with. There's plagiarism, which is intellectual lying, where you take a quote from somebody else and you say it's yours, or you fabricate something, you make a story about something that never happened. Sadly, there's a lot of examples of people in ministry over the years who it's been exposed that their testimony was made up. It wasn't really a true testimony. It wasn't their story, or they were telling somebody else's story, or just making up one out of whole cloth about what a terrible, evil person they was before they were saved. And then you find out they weren't a nice person, but they weren't nearly as terrible as they want to tell you they are now. And then there's simply denial, where we just don't want to own the truth. We just refuse to admit what's true. And somebody will say, well, you said thus and such. And you'll say, I never said that. It would be better for us to say, I don't recall saying that. Maybe I did, but I don't recall that. If I did, I'm sorry. But sometimes we just want to double down and say, that's never true. I've never made that statement. In this day and age, with all of the ability to record just about everything you and I do, it's pretty hard to back away from a lot of things. And it's better to just simply say, I forgot, I don't remember saying that, or boy, I shouldn't have said that, and just forgive me. But it's better to be honest and just come out rather than trying to defend the indefensible. Then there's something that's becoming very common, and I think we as people in this world need to be very aware of. It's basically double speak, where we say things that are intentionally vague or confusing. We use euphemistic language to obscure the truth, and we don't really say what's going off. In other words, we aren't firing people. We're just putting them on leave for an extended period of time. So we all want you to go on an extended leave and have a good time. We're not going to pay you, and we're not going to allow you to ever come back, but we're not firing you. We're just putting you on extended leave. That kind of stuff actually has happened, and it's just basically another form of lying. Hypocrisy is something that Jesus called out the spiritual leaders of his day, and hypocrisy is something that you can say, or it can be something that you just imply. But it's the idea that you claim to have certain moral standards and beliefs that you don't actually live with any kind of regularity. You may be outraged at somebody's bad behavior, but you kind of conceal the fact that you actually engage in the same behavior yourself. And so you have a lot of people who basically say, you can't do this, you can't do that. This is something Jesus called out, but they themselves do it. Or there is what we find increasingly in our world today, propaganda or disinformation. We just send messages out. I find that a lot of the politicians, especially the ones who feel like they have to raise their voice in order to make a point, a lot of times whatever they're accusing the other person of doing is exactly what they're doing. So if they call somebody a hypocrite, they're a hypocrite. If they call somebody a liar, they're lying. If they say they're being a demagogue or a totalitarian, or if they say they're here to defend freedom or liberty or the little guy, you know that just the opposite is true, because all you got to do is look at their actions and you realize that they're not telling the truth. So these are some of the things, and a couple of other terms we use a lot. Like we talk about people who are gaslighting. In other words, that they tell you that what you see, you didn't see. As Groucho Marx said, are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? And that's, a common behavior today. And then finally, there's one that I think that many Christians are guilty of. It's being silent when we should speak. You see, not saying something, not correcting a false impression, a false accusation, when you know what the truth is a form of lying. And I think that many Christians sit by the sidelines today and are very silent about terrible things that are going on in the world because they don't want it to look bad on them. I love Hulk Hogan's comment when he said that he was afraid to wear his Trump hat until he saw President Trump get shot in the ear, almost killed, stand up and say, fight, fight, fight. And he said, when I realized that he was willing to take a bullet for what he believed in, I said I should stop being a coward and start wearing my MAGA hat to show what I believe in. And whether you agree with his politics or not is not important, but the thing was, he recognized that his silence was a form of cowardice and hypocrisy. And I think that's true in the church today, that many, even pastors, are afraid to say openly what they believe to be true because they're afraid of the negative impact that could have upon their quote-unquote ministry, which I call not a ministry, but a career and a profession and a business. I better quit here. We'll continue tomorrow. God bless.